Much of the so-called African slave trade was fabricated and widely exaggerated. There was no trade. An independent source showing that the so-called Indians on the eastern seaboard, also called Terra Nova, were Moors, is called the book African and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes. He shows in the book how many so-called Native American Indians were sold into slavery in Africa and Europe. This is the opposite direction in which we were taught the slave trade went. These Native Americans or Indians were classified as Negroes and blacks in the slave books of Seville, Spain and elsewhere. On page 29 he says, and I quote, "Slaves from Terra Nova show up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. For example, in Valencia during the period to 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel Man, in 1505 Juan and Pedro, and in 1507 Antonio and Juan Amarco. In 1515 Ali, now Melchor, and in 1516 Catalina. They were all classified as Negroes." Unquote. Now, think about this. If we were first brought to North America around 1619, or even as early as 1555 for that matter, then how were they taking slaves from Newfoundland to Europe, all before 1520? Keep in mind that one of the Native Americans even had the name Ali, and all were classified as Negroes once they reached Valencia. How did a Native American in 1515 have a Moorish name, Ali? At least 3,000 Americans, so-called Indians, are known to have been shipped to Europe between 1493 and 1501, the Columbus expeditions, with the likely total possibly double that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. These are major contradictions to the whole slave trade myth. Blacks were always in America. The missing Indians are Negroes. The slaves sold on the slave markets in the South were initially the black people from right here in this hemisphere. As they took the lands here, they enslaved the inhabitants of those lands who were black. The tens of millions of Americans, so-called Indians, who disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Many thousand were sent to Europe and Africa as slaves. The whole slave trade myth is that the whole story was given to us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America, but the truth is that black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as a commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as Africans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems failed to mention in their history program.
So you got to really know your real history. And then a lot of Asiatics know this, but if they tell that real history, they can't keep on promoting the diaspora, which is partly fiction. Because they didn't bring us from anywhere. We were already here. We were here for thousands of years.
It is safe to say that Columbus is solely responsible for slavery of the Moors, from west to east and from east to west. This is the bottom of an African slave ship. These were called big bottoms as they were constructed to hold hundreds of Africans packed like sardines. These trips from Africa to America took up to 3 to 4 months from east to west. According to history, these hundreds of Africans urinated and defecated on themselves during the journey. Now come on, 4 months of constant urination and defecation? These slaves would have literally drowned. Does this story really make sense? The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The first Africans to set foot on American soil were in fact the Dogons of Mali, who used such currents as the Canary and the North Equilateral Current that recycles from West Africa to America and into the upper Atlantic Ocean. This was before the invention of sails. The Guinea current flows eastward along the Guinea coast with frequent cycles out to the sea where it joins the South Equatorial. The second group of Africans to land in America were under the leadership of Abu Bakari in 1311 and had mixed in with the Olmecs and became known as the Washoe. The third group of Africans to land on American soil were the Idrisids, who were the ruling dynasty of southern Morocco and Mauritania, who came into Morocco before the invasion by the Dogon Malians and the Senegalese. This group of Moors arrived in 1727 with Mensa Khan Musa, who was searching for his ancestors of Abu Bakari. And indeed, the Washoes were Moors.
But some adults have difficulty handling that.
Am I saying that there was no slave trade? There was indeed a kidnapping of Africans from Africa to America. However, it was the result of the mass shipment and slaughter of the Moors in America at the hands of the Columbus expeditions. Columbus's first journey in 1492 was a mission to capture gold, but he was sidetracked by the presence of the black Moors. Columbus sent the word back to the monarchs of Spain that there were what he referred to in his logs as the people of the Queen of Sheba. Columbus kidnapped Arawak Indians along with gold nuggets, exotic birds, and grain. Queen Isabella provided Columbus with 17 ships, 1,500 men, cannons, crossbows, guns, and attack dogs for the second voyage. Columbus's new mission was to conquer the West. When Columbus returned to the West, Haiti, and South America in 1493, he not only took raw materials and resources, but he abducted women. After a short time, the Arawaks resisted Columbus, and on March 25, 1495, Columbus slaughtered thousands of Arawak native men, women, and babies. Columbus also rounded up 1,500 Arawaks and shipped them to Spain. Columbus became the first man known in history to send the first slaves across the Atlantic. Other nations rushed to emulate Columbus. In 1501, the Portuguese began to depopulate the Bituque Indians to Cape Verde as slaves. The black Indian slavery destroyed the Indian nations of Natchez, the Yamasee, and the Pequots. Because of this, the first African slave raid took place in 1505 and was spearheaded by Columbus's son. When the Moors, the Indians, of America began dying and committing suicide, the labor was replaced with slaves from the Sahara in West Africa. Also, the gold and silver that Columbus extracted from America fueled a 400% inflation that eroded the economies of the non-European nations and helped Europe to develop a global market system. Africa suffered a great economical blow. The trans-Saharan trade collapsed because America supplied more precious gems than the African West Coast. African traders now only had one commodity that Europe wanted: slaves.
So you need to know the real history so that you must rise where you fell. And you must rise with honor. So you must come into this knowledge with love and not hate. Does not mean that you're supposed to let somebody kick your butt. But don't come in this thing with hate because you're not innocent. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?
It is often not talked about, but the Moors had enslaved the Europeans before they enslaved blacks. Their women were sold like commodities into the harems and as concubines of wealthy Moors. This is the reason why the Moorish noble were for the most part bleached out and became as tawny Moors. Turks, and Arabs, which are no more than fixed mulatto races. This is also the reason for the Moors in the coats of arms of the noble European families, the so-called black nobility of Europe. The European nations paid tribute to the Moors well into the 18th century. In the book, The United States and Barbary Powers, the English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes, and may I say all nations, are tributary to them. David McRitchie in the book Ancient and Modern Britons says the word blackmail is the result of this tribute paid to the black army, or black oppressors, as the English referred to them. The Moors had control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is why the Marines sing of defeating the Moors, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, confirming the extent of the Moorish empire and dominions of Amexem, or Atlantis.
And everybody knows that, but that kind of spoils the game that they've been playing on our people. You see the point? Because they've structured history in such a way to distort history that even in the quest of getting out of the European jurisdiction, they told more lies.
As an African American, we have no inalienable or indigenous rights under the Constitution. Even worse, as an African American Christian, we dig an even deeper hole for ourselves. As black Christians, we have to admit two things. We are former slaves by calling ourselves African, and we are former slaves who converted to the slave owner's religion. Thus, we sever any connection to sovereignty or self-identity. As African American Christians, we literally become dependent on the government and relinquish all indigenous and self-governing classifications. Thus, we throw ourselves on the mercy of the U.S. judicial system. Native Americans have what is called autonomy or self-government, similar to diplomatic immunity. As indigenous people, we have the right to set up our own sovereign nations. We govern our own judicial, legislative, and penal system. As African Americans, we waive the right of self-governing and indigenous rights by admitting that we are immigrants, came over from somewhere else, and not indigenous.